At its peak, McCall's printed 100,000 sewing patterns a day in a Kansas factory so large the road was named for the building. 52 million American women sewed at home. 170 million patterns sold in a single year. The $2 envelope on the fabric store counter was as familiar as a hymnal in a church pew, and for the women who used it, just as essential. Then the decisions began. A leveraged buyout that loaded the company with debt, a sale-leaseback that transferred the factory to a holding company at a third of its value, $90 million extracted in 42 months, a bankruptcy filing 18 months after that. The presses in Manhattan, Kansas, kept running through the collapse, but the company around them was gone. The building still stands. The presses are scrap metal. 4 American pattern brands, McCall's, Simplicity, Buterick, Vogue, sold out of bankruptcy in 2025 for $2.25 million. This is the story of how a Scottish orphan named James McCall built the most intimate industrial relationship American women ever had with a company, and how a century of trust was converted to cash and carried out the door. Not through catastrophe, through arithmetic. The story begins with a boy in Scotland whose mother burned to death. His name was James McCall, born in 1826 in a village near Dumfries, the same year, as it happens, that his future rival Ebenezer Butterick was born 3,000 miles away in Massachusetts. Orphaned before he was old enough to understand what had happened to him. His father dead already. His mother gone in a fire, in a way no child should have to picture. The 1884 obituary in the New York Tribune would record it flatly, the way Victorians recorded terrible things. His father died when he was a boy, and his mother was burned to death not long afterward. One sentence. A lifetime of loss compressed into 12 words. By 15, James was boarding with a coachman named William Murdoch in Dumfries, working as a draper's assistant, folding cloth, measuring fabric, learning with his hands what his childhood hadn't given him time to learn any other way. He apprenticed as a tailor in Glasgow, learned the trade from the thread up, the grain of the cloth, the bias of the cut, the way a seam could make or break the line of a garment, and then he did what a young Scotsman with no family and no inheritance and a trade in his hands did in the middle of the 19th century. He crossed the Atlantic. He settled first in Franklin, a small town in Delaware County, New York, where he married Laura Sophia Ford, a local woman 4 years his elder. But McCall wasn't built for small towns. He went back across the ocean, this time as the general agent in Scotland for the Wheeler and Wilson Sewing Machine Company, the American firm that by 1859 was outproducing every rival in the country. The obituary noted, with the approval Victorians reserved for money honestly made, he was successful in his undertakings and made money rapidly. He understood the machine now, not just the cloth, not just the cut, but the tool that was changing what women could make with their own hands. The tailor's apprentice had become a sewing machine executive. The next step was the one that would change everything. America in the years after the Civil War was building a middle class at a speed the world had never seen. Cities were swelling with immigrants and rural migrants. Women who'd once had their clothes made by tailors, or sewn rough garments by hand or gone without, were buying sewing machines by the 100,000. Isaac Singer's name was on the most famous machines, but Wheeler and Wilson, McCall's employer, was selling just as many. What all those new machine owners lacked was a reliable way to turn a bolt of fabric into a dress that actually fit. Butterick had launched graded paper patterns in 1863 and was building an empire on them. But McCall, the orphan tailor who'd sold the machines that made patterns useful, saw the problem from the other end. The woman standing at her kitchen table with a pair of shears and a length of calico needed more than a piece of tissue paper with holes punched in it. She needed precision. She needed someone who understood both the machine and the cloth to tell her exactly where to cut. Around 1870, McCall withdrew from Wheeler and Wilson and opened a pattern manufactory at 48 East 14th Street in New York, Union Square, the commercial crossroads of the city. He called his product Bizarre Glove Fitting Patterns. The name was a promise, not approximate, not close enough. Glove fitting. And before the paper patterns, he developed something even more unusual, a geometric dress drafting system he called the Royal Chart, advertised in the New York Times on October 27, 1867, as a mathematical arrangement of lines, spaces, and points upon a chart, whereby ladies are enabled accurately to cut the material for their own dresses, and with ease. It is the invention of a Scotsman, a Victorian astrolabe for clothing, the direct ancestor of every pattern piece that would ever carry the McCall name. The earliest surviving McCall's advertisement ran in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle on January 7th, 1871. The 1870 census had listed him as a dealer in sewing machines with a personal estate of $10,000, roughly $250,000 in today's money. By the 1880 census, his profession read Bizarre Patterns. The transition was complete. In 1873, McCall launched a 4-page leaflet called The Queen, a pattern catalog dressed as a periodical. It grew, renamed The Queen of Fashion in 1891, then McCall's Magazine in 1897. The patterns in the magazine fed each other in a loop that would run for a century. The magazine showed what the patterns could make. The patterns gave readers something to do with what they'd seen. It was the first consumer media flywheel in American fashion. James McCall died on March 10, 1884, at 9 West 42nd Street, of a stroke after a month's illness. He was 57. His obituary ran one paragraph. It mentioned the fire that killed his mother. It mentioned Wheeler and Wilson. It did not mention that the business he'd built from a rented room on Union Square would become the most intimate industrial relationship American women would ever have with a corporation. A relationship measured not in transactions, but in the fit of a sleeve, the fall of a hem, the satisfaction of looking in a mirror and knowing you made this yourself, from a pattern that bore one man's name. His widow took the reins. Laura Sophia McCall, running a national pattern enterprise in 1884, an era when women couldn't vote, couldn't easily hold property in most states, couldn't sit on a jury. She hired one of the country's first female magazine editors, a Mrs. George Bladsworth, for the renamed Queen of Fashion. She held the company for 9 years, keeping it profitable, keeping it growing, and in 1893 sold to a businessman named James Henry Otley. Otley renamed it the McCall Company and ran it for 2 decades. His stewardship was solid, unspectacular, profitable, the kind of ownership that builds institutions rather than harvests them. And when he finally sold to a Wall Street syndicate organized by the investment bank White, Weld and Company in 1913, Otley did something that would resonate across the century. Out of his own pocket, he distributed $100,000 among roughly 300 long-tenured employees, a gift equivalent to about $3 million today. The Kansas City Star reported it. The people who'd built the company, Otley believed, deserved a share of what it was worth. White Weld reorganized the business as the McCall Corporation in 1913. With $6.75 million in capital, installed Edward Alfred Simmons as its first president, and set about making McCall the dominant force in American home sewing. The key to that ambition arrived within the decade. For 50 years, every commercial sewing pattern in America, Butterick, McCall, Vogue, all of them, had been the same product: unprinted tissue paper with perforations, tiny holes punched along the cutting lines, the dart placements, the hem folds. Hold the tissue up to the light and you could just about see where to cut. If you couldn't, and millions of women couldn't, not reliably, not every time, you guessed. The instructions, such as they were, lived on the envelope or on a separate guide sheet called a Deltor. American women were deciphering Braille with a pair of scissors and a prayer, and the wonder isn't that so many dresses came out right, but that any of them did. Sometime between 1919 and 1921, McCall introduced the printed pattern: cutting lines, notch marks, grain line arrows, sewing directions, all printed directly on the tissue in black ink. The engineering insight behind it was specific and important. When you stamped perforations through stacks of hundreds of tissue sheets, the bottom layers misregistered by as much as a quarter inch. One bad punch, and 1,000 patterns came out wrong, and 1,000 women cut their fabric in the wrong place, and 1,000 dresses didn't fit. Printing eliminated the defect entirely. McCall patented it, and held the patent until 1938. For nearly 2 decades, the single biggest usability improvement in the history of home sewing belonged exclusively to one company. Simplicity didn't switch to printed patterns until 1946. Butterick converted in the late 40s. Vogue, the aristocrat of the business, held out until 1956, 3.5 decades after McCall had solved the problem. By the time the patent expired, the competitive landscape had shifted permanently. McCall had overtaken Butterick, which in the 1890s had been the second largest printer in the United States after the government printing office, running 86 presses around the clock. McCall beat them not on scale of production, but on something more fundamental: the experience of actually using the product. When you opened a McCall envelope, you could read the tissue. That mattered more than anything else. And there was more. In 1932, McCall pioneered full-color printed pattern envelopes, the illustrated covers that turned fabric store counters into galleries of aspiration, each one showing the finished garment on a model, front and back, with construction details visible. And McCall was the only major pattern company to print the date on every envelope. A small detail, a clerk's instinct, but it meant that every pattern McCall ever manufactured carried the year of its own making inscribed on the product itself. A company that wrote its own history on every piece of tissue it ever sold. The magazine and the patterns grew together, and together they were building something larger than either could have accomplished alone. Otis Wees became editor of McCall's magazine in 1928 at 23 years old and held the chair for 3 decades, a tenure that shaped the magazine into a fixture of middle-class American kitchens and living rooms. Under Wees, the editorial mix was recipes, fashion plates, fiction by serious writers, and domestic advice that assumed its readers were intelligent women, making real decisions about their families' lives. The McCall Corporation acquired Red Book and Blue Book in 1929. Briefly and improbably, it even owned Popular Mechanics. The publishing arm was becoming a small empire of its own. Then came the war, and the empire discovered it was also a public utility. Pattern sales rose from 45 million in 1939 to 70 million by 1943, a 55% increase in 4 years, driven by fabric rationing that made home sewing not just thrifty, but necessary. The War Production Board limited the yardage available for ready-made clothing. If you wanted a new dress and didn't have the ration coupons for a store-bought one, you sewed it yourself. The editorial pages of every women's magazine in the country carried the sew and save message. Domestic handcraft reframed as national service. Simplicity and Vogue designed patterns that minimized fabric consumption, working within government restrictions on seam allowances and skirt widths. McCall's carried the message loudest, its magazine reaching into millions of homes with the argument that a woman at a sewing machine was doing her part as surely as a woman riveting bomber fuselage at a consolidated plant. Making a dress at your kitchen table wasn't economy. It was patriotism. When the boys came home and the baby boom began, the sewing didn't stop. It accelerated. The women who'd sewn victory suits and utility garments and Red Cross bandages kept their machines running. For nurseries now, for school clothes, for the expanding suburbs where a Singer or a Kenmore sat in every spare bedroom, and a McCall's envelope lay open beside the pinking shears on Saturday morning. Butterick's revenue nearly doubled between 1942 and 1948, from $1.7 million to $3.1 million, and every pattern company rode the same post-war wave. American women weren't just sewing because they had to. They were sewing because they'd learned they could, and because the satisfaction of making something with your own hands, something that fit, something your daughter would wear to school on Monday, was worth more than the hours it took. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote her column, If You Ask Me, in McCall's, from 1949 until her death in 1962, 13 years of the most prominent woman in America, speaking directly to the magazine's readers about politics, family, and the texture of daily life. Contributors over the decades included Willa Cather, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ray Bradbury, John Steinbeck, Kurt Vonnegut, Ann Tyler, and Tim O'Brien. Pauline Kael reviewed films for the magazine until she was fired in 1966 for panning The Sound of Music, an incident that said as much about the culture of women's service magazines as it did about Kael. In May 1951, illustrator Kay Morrissey drew the first Betsy McCall paper doll, a monthly cutout feature that would run for 4 decades and spawn dolls merchandise, and a multi-generational hold on American girlhood that no one at the company ever quite understood the value of until it was gone. Under editor John Mack Carter, McCall's magazine peaked in 1962 at 8.4 million paid subscribers, the third largest magazine in the United States. Only Reader's Digest and TV Guide outsold it. The front porch of post-war American womanhood had McCall's name on the mailbox, but the patterns were where the cash lived, and the patterns required factories. In 1923, the McCall Corporation had opened a printing plant on the west side of Dayton, Ohio, along the Home Avenue Railroad corridor. It grew over the following decades until the trade press called it the largest printing plant under one roof anywhere in the world, 38 acres, over 6,000 employees. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The presses never stopped. By the early 1960s, the Dayton plant was turning out 4 million magazines a day. Not just McCall's, but Newsweek, Redbook, Popular Science, and roughly 50 other titles. Alongside the magazines, 100,000 dress patterns every working day. Giant rolls of thin tissue paper fed through web-offset lithographic presses that printed black line art pattern pieces at speeds no human hand could match, then precision cut, folded, and stuffed into full-color envelopes bound for Woolworths, Sears, Kmart, and 30,000 fabric shops from coast to coast. The designer collaborations reflected the scale. Madeleine Vionnet in 1926, Jean Lanvin in 1927, Elsa Schiaparelli in 1929, Givenchy, Courage. By the 1980s, the envelopes carried Brooke Shields and Nolan Miller's Dynasty collection, Joan Collins, Linda Evans, Diane Carroll, Hollywood glamour you could sew at your kitchen table for $2 on a Sunday afternoon. Lauren Hutton modeled on the covers. Paris fashion, Kansas fabric stores, and the distance between aspiration and execution was the width of a tissue paper pattern piece. Home sewers spent $1 billion in 1963. Patterns, fabric, notions, machines. From the 1940s through the 1970s, roughly 52 million American women and girls sewed at home. 2 companies dominated the pattern trade. In 1983, Simplicity held 39.4% of the market. McCall held 29.7%. Between 2 factories, Simplicity's in Niles, Michigan, and McCall's succession of plants, nearly 70% of every pattern sold in the country passed through one of 2 sets of presses. And in 1976, Americans bought 170 million sewing patterns. More patterns that year than the entire American book publishing industry moved in titles. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. In 1969, the McCall Corporation opened a new plant in Manhattan, Kansas. Not the island, the prairie. The address, 615 McCall Road, the street named for the factory it led to. A purpose-built, single-story industrial facility on 14 acres at the edge of town. The logic was the logic of post-war American manufacturing. Kansas was right to work. Dayton was heavily unionized. The printers and pressmen's locals powerful enough to shape costs. Central Plains distribution cut shipping to both coasts. And Fort Riley, the Army base just down the highway, provided a ready labor pool. Military spouses who needed steady work while their husbands served rotations that, in 1969 and 1970, often meant Vietnam. One woman hired in the plant's first year remembered it decades later. She was 21, her husband was overseas. She was grateful to get the job. The people were great, she said. It was a nice new plant and she really liked the work. She was 21 then. She'd be 76 when it closed. The building expanded in 1970 to 147,000 square feet, eventually growing to nearly 282,000. White walls, flat metal roof, 18-foot ceilings held up by columns, spaced 35 feet apart, built for machines, not beauty. By the mid-70s, more than 1,000 people worked there across 3 shifts, around the clock. If you'd walked through that building on a weekday morning in 1975, you'd have smelled it before you understood it. The dry, almost sweet scent of tissue stock and bulk, Reams of paper so thin you could see your hand through it, mingling with the chemical sharpness of offset ink and the faintly metallic odor of press lubricant. The 5 web-fed offset lithographic presses dominated the floor like enormous spines, each one fed by tissue rolls that unwound through the printing stages, laying down the black line art pattern pieces in multiple sizes simultaneously. The tissue moved through the press in a continuous web, printed on both sides, then wound onto fresh rolls headed for the cutting operation downstream. It was there, in the cutting and folding machines, that the real secrets lived. Precision systems that sliced the printed tissue into individual pattern pieces, folded them into the exact configurations specified for each envelope, and delivered them to the inserting stations that married the folded tissue to the pre-printed full-color envelopes. The rhythm was constant. The mechanical hum of the presses, the rapid stutter of the folding machines, the soft whisper of tissue running through conveyors. It wasn't loud the way a steel mill was loud. No one was pouring molten metal here. But it was persistent, a low-grade industrial pulse that became the background frequency of your working life. You stopped noticing it after a few weeks on the floor. You noticed its absence for the rest of your life. The workforce was predominantly women, not by accident, by inheritance. McCall's had been built by women, for women, from the day Laura Sophia McCall took over in 1884. The Manhattan plant drew from the town, from the farming communities across Riley County, and from Fort Riley. Vera Martin, from tiny Wheaton, Kansas, population under 500, worked at the plant until she retired. Johanna Mary Estes, born in 1920, was part of the first hiring wave when the doors opened. Wilbur Coffey, a Kansas State University graduate, ran the pre-press department for years. The man who ensured that every pattern piece was positioned correctly, every cutting line registered to within a fraction of an inch, every size range labeled before the tissue hit the press. A quarter-inch error on a bodice front meant a dress that pulled across the chest or gaped at the neckline, a customer who didn't trust the pattern next time, a reputation assembled over a century fraying one bad print run at a time. The people who ran those machines understood that. They carried it as professional knowledge and personal pride. The Dayton plant, renamed Dayton Press, closed in 1982. The building still stands on Home Avenue, holding a different kind of silence now. Pattern production consolidated entirely to Kansas, and the technology inside 615 McCall Road was so specialized, so specific to this single product, that a printer from a neighboring facility who toured the building said he'd never once been allowed inside when the pattern presses were actually running. The press design, the roll winding systems, the tissue cutting geometries, all of it proprietary, all of it evolved over decades of trial and adjustment, all of it resident in the hands and habits of the people who ran the machines. When the plant finally closed, half a century later, the company scrapped the 5 tissue presses and the 2 folding machines rather than sell them. Nobody else could have used them. Nobody else knew how. In its peak years, the Manhattan plant was Manhattan, Kansas, in a way that's hard to describe to someone who's never lived in a company town. It wasn't the only employer. Kansas State University was down the road, and Fort Riley was just west, but it was the employer that made things. The one where you clocked in and clocked out and came home with ink on your hands and a paycheck that paid the mortgage. The road bore the company's name. The jobs passed from one generation to the next, mother to daughter in some cases, because the work was steady and the skills were specific, and the product was something you could explain to your family. We print the patterns that women all over America use to make their clothes. There was a legibility to it, a purpose you could hold up against any other job in town. You made something, something real, something that traveled from this building in Kansas to 30,000 fabric counters and ended up in the hands of a woman standing at her kitchen table with a pair of shears. And when she finished the dress and it fit, some fraction of that fit belonged to you. What 615 McCall Road produced traveled outward in cardboard shipping boxes to a retail network that, at its zenith in the 1970s, numbered 30,000 outlets across the United States. Joann Fabrics, Hancock Fabrics, Cloth World, the fabric departments of Sears, Woolworths, Kmart, J.C. Penney. In every one of those stores, the pattern counter occupied its own territory. long cabinets topped with oversized three-ring binders chained to the counter, organized by season, garment type, and size range, each binder holding dozens of illustrated pattern envelopes. Women stood at those counters and turned pages with the slow, appraising attention of people choosing something that mattered. The envelopes showed the finished garment from the front and the back, sometimes with a lining view, always on a model in a specific pose designed to reveal the construction. $2 bought the tissue, the instruction sheet, the yardage chart, and that illustrated envelope. It was aspirational and practical in a single transaction. Here is what it could look like, and here is exactly how to make it happen. The cultural weight of what those counters represented is difficult to recover at this distance. Home sewing in the post-war decades wasn't a hobby. It was infrastructure. It was how families of 4 and 5 and 6 got dressed without going broke. Mothers made school clothes, Easter dresses, Halloween costumes, prom gowns, First Communion outfits, christening gowns, and Sunday church dresses. Grandmothers taught granddaughters on treadle machines in farmhouse kitchens, passing down not just the skill, but the satisfaction of it, the particular pride of walking into a room wearing something you made yourself. 4-H dress reviews were a rite of passage in rural America. Girls as young as 10 standing before judges at county fairs, turning slowly so the seam, finishing, and hem depth and buttonhole spacing could be inspected. The expectation wasn't perfection. It was competence. The ability to look at a flat piece of fabric and see the garment inside it, and then to bring that garment into being with your hands, and a machine, and a $2 pattern. Home economics was required in most American public schools through the 1970s, and the McCall's pattern was standard text. Not a textbook in the academic sense, better than that. A set of instructions that assumed you could do it, that guided you through the doing, and that rewarded you at the end with something real, something you could wear. To own a sewing machine and know your way around a pattern was to participate in a covenant as old as the American middle class itself, that a woman could make something beautiful and useful with her own hands, for less than she'd pay at Sears, and carry the quiet, specific pride of knowing she'd made it herself. But one decision, made years before anyone noticed, had already weakened the foundation. Norton Simon Industries, which had taken control of the McCall Corporation in 1956, sold McCall's magazine to the Pritzker family in 1973. They kept the pattern business. It seemed like a clean separation. The publishing arm went one direction, the manufacturing arm went another. What it actually severed was the strongest marketing flywheel in the industry. 8 million subscribers had been previewing patterns in their monthly magazine, circling the ones they liked, ordering by mail, or heading to the fabric counter on Saturday morning with the page torn out. That loop, see it in the magazine, buy the pattern, make the dress, had driven customer loyalty for the better part of a century. Now the magazine promoted someone else's vision. The patterns competed on their own. 13 years before anyone on Wall Street noticed the company existed, the engine that held the whole system together was already running on 2 separate tracks, heading slowly apart. By 1983, McCall Pattern Company was a profitable, debt-free, cash-generating business. $6 million in earnings on $51.9 million in revenue, a 29.7% share of the American home sewing pattern market, proprietary printing technology that no competitor could replicate, a brand name recognized in every fabric store in the country, 113 years of accumulated consumer trust, the kind of intangible that didn't show up on a balance sheet but showed up every time a woman reached for the McCall's binder instead of the simplicity one. The conglomerate that owned it wasn't interested. Esmark, which had swallowed Norton Simon Industries in a hostile takeover, put the pattern division on the block. CEO Don Kelly told the financial press the business didn't fit the long-term portfolio. Inside 615 McCall Road, workers who'd spent a decade or more building specialized skills heard through the trade grapevine that their company was for sale, a line item in someone else's restructuring. But there were numbers that nobody at the pattern counter was looking at. Home sewers had fallen from 52 million in the 1950s to 44 million by 1974, and the decline was accelerating. Pattern sales would collapse from 170 million units in 1976 to 50 million by 1988, a 70% decline in 12 years. The cost advantage that had justified home sewing for generations was evaporating as Asian imports flooded American stores with garments so cheap that buying fabric and a pattern and spending a weekend at the machine no longer saved money. It cost more. Retail outlets were contracting, 30,000 shrinking toward 10,000, and the surviving chains were giving patterns less floor space every year. Women were entering the paid workforce in numbers that cut the available hours for sewing in half. Female labor force participation rose from 33% in 1950 to 57% by 1990. Second wave feminism had reframed the domestic arts. Home economics classes were being relabeled. 4-H dress reviews were thinning. The cultural assumption that a capable woman knew her way around a sewing machine was shifting from expectation to option, from necessity to nostalgia. None of this was visible from inside the plant in the early 1980s. The presses were running. The orders were shipping. The product was as good as it had ever been. The women who folded the tissue and packed the envelopes and loaded the trucks weren't tracking labor force participation rates or reading trade analyses of Asian import penetration. They were doing their jobs, the same jobs they'd been doing for a decade, and the paychecks cleared, and the product went out the door, and nobody came down to the floor to say that anything had changed. And then something happened that made the numbers look better than they had in the company's entire history. In 1985 and 1986, the first and second full years under a new owner, McCall Pattern posted $12 million and $14 million in profit, respectively, the two most profitable years in the company's 113-year history. The cash was flowing faster than it ever had. The man who owned the company had been looking for exactly this, a profitable, overlooked business inside a conglomerate that wanted out. His name was Reginald Lewis. He was a Harvard-trained lawyer from East Baltimore who'd spent a decade trying and failing to close his first major deal, turned down by Park Sausage, walked away from a furniture maker at the closing table, losing money on a radio station in the Virgin Islands. McCall was his first success. He'd paid $22.5 million for the entire company, $1 million of his own money, the rest in bank debt. The two most profitable years in McCall's history were years 1 and 2 under his watch, and the cash that those proprietary presses generated, the cash that those skilled Kansas workers produced, that a century of consumer trust delivered to the bottom line, was about to be used for something the people inside those walls could not have imagined. That was the summit, the highest point the company would ever reach, the highest point that 113 years of accumulated skill and trust and tissue paper engineering would ever produce. And nobody working those presses, folding that tissue, packing those envelopes into boxes bound for 30,000 fabric counters across America, had any way of knowing it yet. Reginald Francis Lewis was born on December 7th, 1942, in East Baltimore, a neighborhood of row houses and corner stores where ambition and limitation lived on the same block, where a black kid with a fast mind learned early that the distance between potential and permission was measured in things other than talent. His mother, Carolyn Cooper Lewis Fugit, was a teacher. His father, Clinton Lewis, left when Reginald was 9. The boy raised himself into a competitor. At Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, a segregated school named for a black poet who died at 33, he was quarterback, shortstop, basketball captain, and student body vice president, not content to do one thing well when he could do 4 things well and still have energy left over. He played football at Virginia State University on a scholarship until a knee injury ended his athletic career and redirected the energy into something more dangerous and more durable: the focused, absolute pursuit of being the best at whatever he decided to touch. He graduated, and then he went to Harvard Law School. The story, which Lewis told freely, and which Harvard never denied, was that he was the only person in the school's history admitted before formally applying, recruited through a Rockefeller Foundation summer program for promising black students in the summer before his senior year. He graduated in 1968, practiced for 2 years at Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, one of New York's most prestigious firms, in an era when a black associate at a white shoe firm was itself a statement, and then left to build something that belonged to him. He co-founded what was widely called Wall Street's first majority black law firm, later reorganized in 1973 as Lewis and Clarkson, with partner Charles Clarkson. Through the 1970s, he structured an estimated $100 million in transactions for minority-owned enterprises through the government's MESBIC program. He was sharp, relentless, and intolerant of slippage in others. He worked the way people work who've been told no enough times that yes becomes a personal matter. His signature self-description: I think of myself as an American of African descent who's committed to what he is doing. He resisted being framed by race alone. He wanted to be framed by results. But the results he wanted, the leveraged buyout that would make him a principal and not just an advisor, an owner and not just a counselor, kept slipping away. In 1975, he tried to buy Park Sausage, Baltimore's iconic black-owned meat packer, writing $1 million down payment check. Chairman Raymond Haysbert and the bankers at Lehman Brothers turned him down. In 1977 and 78, he spent 18 months courting a leisure furniture manufacturer called Almet. The deal collapsed at the closing table after months of due diligence and legal bills. He bought a radio station, WSTT, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It lost money for 4 years. Lewis wrote afterward, with the self-awareness that sometimes accompanies long frustration. The only conclusion I could reach was that even after finding the needle in the haystack, I still was not ready. By 1983, he was 41 years old. He'd been trying to close a major acquisition for nearly a decade. He was running out of patience with patience itself. The McCall Pattern Company was where the readiness arrived, not because the company was ideal, but because the circumstances were. Norton Simon Industries had owned McCall since 1956. Esmark had swallowed Norton Simon in a hostile takeover. CEO Don Kelly wanted out of the pattern business, publicly, on the record, without sentiment. Lewis saw the math the way a Harvard-trained deal lawyer sees math. Norton Simon had extracted $18 million of cash from McCall in the 2.5 years it owned it. The brand was trusted. The product was proprietary. The asking price, $22.5 million, was modest enough that the deal could be structured almost entirely on debt. On January 29, 1984, Lewis closed the acquisition, $1 million of his own money. The equity, approximately $19 million in senior loans from Bankers Trust, $2.5 million subordinated. First Boston Corporation arranged the institutional financing. The deal included the Manhattan, Kansas plant, the real estate under it, and the brand that had been on American pattern envelopes for 113 years. Lewis retained Earl K. Engstadt Jr., who'd been running the pattern operation since 1970, a Dartmouth graduate, former Abercrombie and Fitch president, a man who understood the printing equipment and the customer base and the seasonal rhythms of the business, as CEO and minority investor. For the first 2 years, it worked. Lewis wasn't a passive owner. He cut overhead, introduced new product lines, pushed exports to China and the United Kingdom and Australia, used idle press capacity at the Manhattan plant to print greeting cards. He recruited managers from rival firms. The operational improvements were genuine, and the results reflected it. $12 million in profit in 1985, $14 million in 1986. The two most profitable years the McCall Pattern Company had ever posted in its entire history. By 1985, Lewis's TLC Group was number 8 on the Black Enterprise Top 100 list of black-owned businesses. The decade of failures was over. He'd done it. But outside the walls of 615 McCall Road, the ground was shifting in ways that no amount of operational talent could reverse. Every year through the 1980s, the number of American women who sewed at home continued its long decline. Pattern volume was in freefall, from 170 million units sold in 1976 toward 50 million by 1988, a 70% collapse in a dozen years. The fabric stores where patterns were sold were closing by the hundreds. Cloth World had vanished. Hancock Fabrics was struggling. The pattern departments at Sears and Kmart and Woolworths were shrinking. Less floor space, fewer binders, fewer customers flipping through the envelopes. The economics of home sewing had flipped. For 3 generations, making a dress at home had been cheaper than buying one. By the mid-1980s, it wasn't. Asian manufactured garments, from South Korea, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, and increasingly from mainland China, were flooding American retail at prices that made the cost of fabric plus pattern plus a weekend of labor look irrational. A blouse at the mall cost $12. The fabric alone to sew it cost $10. Add the pattern, the thread, the interfacing, the zipper, and the 8 hours of your Saturday, and you were paying more for the homemade version than for the manufactured one. Simplicity's Beth Morrow told the press bluntly, the cost advantage had disappeared. Women were entering the paid workforce at rates that have the hours available for sewing. Female labor force participation climbed from 33% in 1950 to 57% by 1990. A woman working 40 hours a week didn't have a Saturday to spend at the sewing machine. Second-wave feminism had reframed the domestic arts. Home economics classes in public schools were being relabeled or dropped. 4-H dress reviews were thinning out, and the cultural assumption that a capable woman knew her way around a sewing pattern was fading from expectation to option, from necessity to nostalgia. And the marketing flywheel that might have fought back against all of this, McCall's magazine, with its 8 million subscribers, its pattern previews, its monthly prompt to go to the fabric store, had been someone else's property since 1973. The magazine went through a succession of owners in the 1980s and 1990s, each one further from the pattern business. The connection between the McCall's name on the magazine rack and the McCall's name on the pattern counter, the connection that James McCall had forged in 1873 with a 4-page leaflet called The Queen, was severed, and no one was going to restore it. Lewis knew the market was declining. The question is whether he cared. He was not building a long-term manufacturing business. He was executing a financial transaction. The distinction mattered, not because one was moral and the other wasn't, but because the company on the other end of the transaction was 113 years old and employed 500 people in a Kansas town where the road was named after the factory. The money came out of the McCall Pattern Company in 4 stages, each one larger than the last, over a period of roughly 18 months. The documentary record, assembled by creditors' attorneys and preserved in federal court filings at the Southern District of New York, lays out the mechanism with arithmetic precision. In December 1986, Lewis and his co-investors took a special distribution, approximately $19 million, paid out as dividends to the shareholders of TLC Pattern, Inc. This was the cash the company had generated during its 2 record-setting years, cash earned by the workers in Manhattan, Kansas, on the proprietary presses that printed 100 million pattern pieces a year. It left the building where it had been earned and traveled to the accounts of a small group of investors in New York. Then came the real estate transaction, and this is the one that, more than any other element of the deal, brought the abstraction of financial engineering into physical contact with the factory floor in Manhattan, Kansas. Lewis's holding company, TLC Holdings, purchased the Manhattan manufacturing facility, the plant itself, the building, the 14 acres of land at 615 McCall Road, from the operating company. The price, according to the creditors' subsequent legal filings, approximately 1/3 of the property's fair market value. Having acquired the building at a steep discount from the very company that needed it to operate, TLC Holdings then leased the building back to the Pattern Company at roughly twice the prevailing market rate under a 10-year lease agreement. Consider what this meant in daily practice. The workers inside the plant noticed nothing. The presses didn't stop. The address was the same. The parking lot filled at the same hour. The tissue moved through the same rollers. The envelopes came off the same inserting machines. The boxes went out the same loading docks. But the building where these women and men reported for work every morning, the same building they'd been working in for years, running the same presses, producing the same patterns, now belonged to a different legal entity than the company that signed their paychecks. And the rent flowing from the operating company to TLC Holdings was double what an arm's-length landlord would have charged for a comparable industrial property in Riley County, Kansas, month after month, year after year, for a decade. The operating company would be paying above-market rent on a building it used to own outright, enriching the holding structure at the direct expense of the operating margin that determined whether the workers' jobs survived. The factory had been converted into a cash extraction mechanism. The workers generated the revenue. The revenue paid the inflated rent. The rent enriched the holding company. The holding company belonged to Lewis. The people inside the building were generating the profits of their own dispossession. Third, TLC Pattern paid more than $15 million to redeem stock warrants the TLC Group had originally acquired for $3.1 million. A net transfer of approximately $12 million from the operating company's balance sheet to the holding company's accounts in exchange for financial instruments that had cost Lewis a fraction of the redemption price. After this transaction, TLC Pattern's net worth turned negative. The company owed more than it owned. It was, in the accounting sense, already insolvent. And fourth, the exit. In mid-1987, Lewis sold the company to John Crowther Group plc, a Yorkshire-based carpet and textile conglomerate, through a U.S. acquisition vehicle called GJS1 Acquisition, Inc. The sale price? $63 million in cash. Press reports commonly rounded to $65 million. The company was renamed Crowther's McCall Pattern. Inc. Lewis retained a minority equity position alongside Shearson Lehman. The majority went to Crowther's Overseas Holdings, EEN Phi, a Netherlands Antilles subsidiary of the British parent. The total, the special dividend, $19 million. The below-market real estate sale and above-market leaseback. A stream of inflated rent payments valued in the millions over the life of the 10-year lease. The warrant redemption, $12 million net, the operating company paying 5 times what the financial instruments had cost the holding company to acquire. The cash sale to Crowther, $63 million. Total shareholder return across the 4 transactions, approximately $90 million on an original equity investment of $1 million. A 90-to-1 return in 42 months. In the history of American leveraged buyouts, an era of spectacular returns, this was among the most efficient extractions ever executed on a company of McCall's size. Lewis's personal share was roughly $52 million from the sale, plus approximately $3 million through TLC Holdings. The figures alleged in the federal complaint and never denied in the public record. His co-investors, Angstadt, Samuel Peabody, Richard Olivares, and a TLC pattern board that included Lewis's half-brother, Gene Fugett, a former tight end for the Dallas Cowboys and Washington Redskins who'd become a lawyer, and Lee Archer Jr., a decorated Tuskegee Airman turned corporate director, divided the balance. These were not anonymous institutional actors. They were individuals with names and biographies, sitting in a boardroom, voting to approve each transaction. The elegiac framing does not require anonymity. It requires restraint in judgment. The transactions speak for themselves. The buyer, Crowther, financed the purchase by loading the acquired company with debt, the same structure that had been used in hundreds of leveraged buyouts across the decade, the same logic that was simultaneously producing the Revco collapse, the Federated Department Stores bankruptcy, and the near destruction of a dozen household names. Bridge loans from Bankers Trust and Shearson Lehman Brothers were replaced when the surviving corporation, now named Crowther's McCall Pattern, Inc., issued $35 million in senior notes to the Travelers Insurance Company. The proceeds repaid the bridge lenders. The $35 million in long-term debt remained on the operating company's books. The pattern business that James McCall had founded debt-free in 1870, that Laura McCall had run debt-free through the 1880s, that Otley and White, Weld, and Norton Simon had maintained without significant leverage through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and 6 decades of continuous printing. That business now owed $35 million it had never chosen to borrow, in an industry losing customers at double-digit rates every year. The debt service alone consumed a share of operating income that left almost nothing for investment, maintenance, innovation, or the kind of product development that might have slowed the market's decline. Roughly 1/3 of the large leveraged buyouts of the 1980s ended in financial distress or bankruptcy. McCall was not an outlier. It was the median case, a profitable cash-flowing business loaded with acquisition debt it couldn't service once the market turned. The difference was that most of the famous LBO failures involved companies whose products, department stores, drugstore chains, supermarket operators, survived the financial engineering. The companies went bankrupt. The stores kept selling. McCall's product was different. The product was a $2 piece of tissue paper that depended on a cultural habit that was dying. The financial engineering didn't kill the habit, but it ensured that the company would be too weakened to adapt as the habit faded. Lewis, meanwhile, was already gone, mentally if not contractually. 6 months after the McCall sale closed, he used the proceeds and the deal credibility to execute the $985 million leveraged buyout of Beatrice International Foods, financed by Michael Milken's Drexel Burnham Lambert, backed by junk bonds and a $450 million credit line from manufacturers Hanover Trust. It was the largest offshore acquisition by an American firm to that date. It made Reginald Lewis the wealthiest African American in the country. Henry Kravis of KKR, the most powerful name in leveraged buyouts, had said publicly that Lewis didn't have the credibility for a billion-dollar deal. Lewis closed it anyway. McCall was not the destination. McCall was the proving ground and the treasury. And the numbers, if you laid them out side by side, told a story that didn't require a prosecutor to interpret. Lewis and his co-investors put in $1 million in January 1984. They extracted approximately $90 million over the subsequent 42 months. The company they left behind owed $35 million. In debt it had never chosen to take on, was paying rent on a building it used to own, and was competing for customers in a market that was losing ground every single quarter. In Manhattan, Kansas, the presses ran. The workers folded tissue and stuffed envelopes and loaded trucks. They were doing the same work they'd always done. But the company they worked for, the financial structure around them, was a different thing entirely from the one that had employed them 3 years earlier. The cash they generated flowed upward through a structure designed to extract it, and the debt that had been loaded onto the company flowed downward into the operating costs that determined whether the next quarterly payment to Travelers Insurance could be met. The answer came 18 months later. It could not. Crowther's McCall pattern, Inc. defaulted on its principal payment to Travelers Insurance in late 1988. The quarterly interest was manageable. The principal was not. Pattern volume across the American home sewing industry had fallen to roughly 50 million units, not even a third of what it had been 12 years earlier. Retail outlets had contracted from 30,000 to fewer than 10,000. Every quarter, the number went down. Every quarter, more women chose to buy a blouse at the mall rather than sew one at the kitchen table. The $35 million in senior notes demanded cash flow that the shrinking market could no longer reliably produce. On December 9, 1988, the company filed for voluntary Chapter 11 protection in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York, Judge Howard C. Bushman III presiding. Debtors' Counsel, Strook and Levon. Creditors' Committee Counsel, Rosenman and Collin. 18 months. That was the interval. The sale to Crowther closed in mid-1987. The bankruptcy petition was filed in December 1988, 18 months from a $90 million shareholder payday to a federal courthouse. The presses in Manhattan, Kansas, kept running. Chapter 11 is reorganization, not liquidation. The company continued operating as debtor in possession, printing and shipping patterns to the shrinking constellation of fabric stores that still stocked them. Employment had dropped from over 1,000 in the 1970s to roughly 500. The 3 shifts were gone. The parking lot that had once been full by 6:30 in the morning now held a fraction of the cars it was built for. But the building was still there, the tissue still moved through the presses, the envelopes still went out the door. McCall patterns were still on the counters at Jo-Ann Fabrics and the surviving independent fabric shops. The product was still trusted. The company around it was in ruins. The workers knew. Not the legal details, not the fraudulent conveyance theories or the Delaware dividend statutes, but the fact of it. The fact that the company they'd worked for had been sold, loaded with debt, and pushed into bankruptcy in the space of 2 years. The fact that their employment, which had once felt as solid as the concrete floor under the presses, now depended on a federal judge's decisions about reorganization plans and creditor priorities. The uncertainty was its own kind of weight, carried through every shift. In September 1989, the creditors' committee sued. The case, Crowther's McCall pattern, Inkeo versus Lewis, number 89, Civil 5971, Southern District of New York, before Judge Morris E. Lasker. 10 counts: constructive fraudulent conveyance, actual intent fraudulent conveyance, breach of fiduciary duty against the TLC pattern directors who had approved the transactions, aiding and abetting against Bankers Trust for structuring the original leverage buyout and against Shearson Lehman for its role in the Crowther sale financing, unlawful dividends under Delaware corporate law, the state where TLC pattern was incorporated, violation of the traveler's insurance indenture, which had contained covenants designed to prevent exactly the kind of asset stripping that the creditors alleged had occurred. And Count X, the most aggressive theory in the complaint, piercing the corporate veil against Reginald Lewis personally on the grounds that he had exercised complete domination and control over TLC Pattern Inc., had treated the company as his personal instrumentality and had caused transfers from the company for his own benefit and to the detriment of its creditors. The defendants named in the complaint read like a roster of the deal itself, and naming them matters, because anonymous institutional language is what makes these transactions seem inevitable rather than chosen. Lewis, 7 Shearson Lehman entities, Bankers Trust Company, and the directors of TLC Pattern, each one a person who had sat in a room and voted: Angstadt, Peabody, Olivares, Jean Fugette, the former NFL tight end, Lewis's half-brother, who had moved from the football field to a law degree to a corporate boardroom, Lee Archer Jr., a man who had flown combat missions over Europe as a Tuskegee airman and survived, and who now found his name in a fraudulent conveyance complaint, Robert DeJong, Sanford Cloud Jr., Marilda Alfonso, James Obey. Each one had approved the transactions that, taken together, had removed approximately $90 million from a company that entered bankruptcy court 18 months later. Judge Lasker's substantive opinion, issued on July 3, 1991, denied the motions to dismiss on most counts. The claims against Lewis survived. The claims against Bankers Trust survived. The fiduciary duty counts against the directors survived. The piercing the veil count, the most aggressive theory in the complaint, survived. The case moved toward discovery. It never reached trial. On January 19, 1993, Reginald Lewis died of brain cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan. He was 50 years old. He left behind his wife, Loida Nicholas Lewis, a Filipina immigration lawyer he'd married in 1969, and their daughters, Leslie and Christina. He left behind the TLC Beatrice International Empire, which his half-brother Jean Fugette would run for a year before Loida assumed control. And he left behind a legal case, still pending, that alleged the transaction he was proudest of had constituted fraud on the company's creditors. His funeral was held at Riverside Church on January 25th, the same Harlem landmark where Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his Beyond Vietnam speech. The obituaries in the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, Black Enterprise, and papers across the country framed him overwhelmingly as what he had been: a barrier-shattering financier, the first African American to build a billion-dollar company, a Harvard law graduate who had forced open doors in the most exclusive corridors of American capitalism. His $3 million gift to Harvard Law School, the largest individual gift in the school's history at the time, had endowed the Reginald F. Lewis International Law Center, the first major HLS facility named for an African American. His philanthropic commitments were substantial and real. The McCall deal, in most of the obituary coverage, occupied a sentence or a paragraph, a footnote on the way to Beatrice. The story of what happened to the operating company, the bankruptcy, the creditors' suit, the workers in Kansas, the debt that didn't belong on the balance sheet, was not the story the press chose to tell. The story they told was about a black man who'd broken through. Both stories were true. The press told one of them. The Crowthers-McCall lawsuit was resolved without a public verdict. The Federal Reporter record stops at the motion to dismiss stage. No jury ever heard the evidence. The creditors' allegations that the 1986 and 1987 transactions had left the company insolvent for inadequate consideration, that the real estate leaseback had been executed at below market value, that the warrant redemption had stripped the company's net worth to below zero, survived judicial scrutiny at every stage the court examined them. They were never tested at trial because the principal defendant died before the trial could occur. Meanwhile, the bankruptcy court had already confirmed a plan of reorganization. A Philadelphia private equity firm called Demling, Schreiber, and Park, through an acquisition vehicle called McCall Acquisition Company, bought the going concern for $45 million plus adjustments. The emerged entity was renamed the McCall Pattern Company. Lewis, still technically a common stockholder, objected to the plan. The court overruled him. $45 million for the whole company, the brand, the plant, the presses, the inventory, the customer relationships, the archive of patterns going back to the 1870s. Less than half of what Lewis and his co-investors had extracted in 1986 and 1987. The arithmetic doesn't require commentary. It sits on the page and does its own work. Across the Atlantic, the chain of consequences reached its terminus. In 1988, the same year Crothers McCall filed for bankruptcy, UK home furnishings conglomerate Colorol had acquired John Crowther Group plc, the British parent of the entity that had bought McCall from Lewis, for £215 million. Colorol's chairman, John Ashcroft, had been on a debt-fueled acquisition spree across the British Isles. In June 1990, Colorol collapsed under approximately £500 million of debt. The UK High Court appointed Ernst & Young as receivers. Ashcroft's empire disintegrated. The American pattern subsidiary's bankruptcy and the British parent's implosion, two companies joined by the same leveraged acquisition, financed by the same logic, both unable to service the debt that the logic demanded, occurred within 18 months of each other. The deal that was supposed to create value at every level of the chain destroyed value at every level instead. From a Manhattan law office to a Kansas factory floor to a Yorkshire boardroom, the consequences radiated outward from the same set of transactions. The McCall Pattern Company survived. That fact alone distinguishes it from most of the companies that went through what McCall went through in the 1980s, the Revcos, the Federateds, the dozens of leveraged enterprises that entered Chapter 11 and never came out. Under Demling, Schreiber, and Park, a firm that specialized in buying distressed companies out of bankruptcy, the brand rebuilt quietly through the 1990s. The market was smaller, the ambitions were proportionate, and in 2001, McCall did something that would have been unimaginable in 1988. It acquired Butterick Publishing Company and Vogue Patterns, the oldest name in American sewing patterns and the most prestigious one, both absorbed by the company that Wall Street had nearly killed a decade earlier. Butterick's printing plant in Altoona, Pennsylvania, closed. Production consolidated to 615 McCall Road in Manhattan, Kansas. 3 of the 4 names in the American pattern counter now came from a single source, but the market never came back. Every year, fewer women sewed. Every year, more fabric stores closed. Hancock Fabrics went bankrupt. Cloth World vanished. The pattern sections at Sears, Kmart, Woolworths, gone, the stores themselves often gone. What remained was a devoted, aging, shrinking customer base and an industry consolidated to the point where the whole thing fit inside a single ownership chain. In December 2016, CSS Industries, a publicly traded gift wrap and seasonal products company based in Pennsylvania, acquired the McCall Pattern Company for $14 million in cash. $14 million. For the brand, the inventory, the intellectual property, and the Manhattan, Kansas plant. A company that had produced $90 million in shareholder returns for one investor group in 1986 to 87 sold 3 decades later for $14 million. CSS added Simplicity the following year for $64 million. All 4 legacy brands under one roof. Then CSS was acquired by UK-based IG Design Group in January 2020. In June 2021, the closure announcement came. Abby Small, Executive Vice President and General Manager of Craft at Design Group, told the Manhattan Mercury that the printing facility at 615 McCall Road would shut down by year's end. 85 employees would lose their jobs. Printing would move to the former Simplicity plant in Neenah, Wisconsin. 85 workers. Some had been there for decades. Design Group offered flat stay bonuses. no severance. The 5 tissue presses and 2 folding machines, the proprietary equipment that had printed patterns for over 50 years, technology so specialized that no other printer in the world could replicate it, were scrapped. Not sold, not donated, not preserved. Destroyed. The knowledge embedded in those machines, the tension settings, the tissue feed calibrations, the folding geometries, went with them. The building was sold in 2022 to a local development group, Flint Hills Ventures, Patrick Shutter, and Blake Bauer, and converted to industrial warehouse space. The McCall Road name stayed on the street sign. The ownership chain continued its descent. IG Design sold the U.S. operation in 2025 for $1. Design Group Americas filed Chapter 11 in Texas that July. 845 layoffs across 6 states. And in September 2025, a bankruptcy judge approved the sale of the sewing pattern brands McCall, Simplicity, Butterick, Vogue, plus several smaller lines and 200 boxes of historical archives, to a New York private equity firm called Rubelman Capital. The price, $2,250,000 for 4 brands with a combined age of over 400 years. In October 2025, the brands re-emerged under a new entity, Simplicity Patterns, Inc. The CEO was Abby Small, the same woman who'd stood in front of the cameras 4 years earlier to announce the Manhattan plant closure, now returned to lead a resurrection. 78 employees. Printing in Neenah, Wisconsin, a strategy built around digital PDFs and projectable pattern files and vintage reissues. Her quote to the trade press carried the weight of the whole arc. We're really a startup that's almost 200 years old. The building at 615 McCall Road still stands. Low, white, enormous, nearly 300,000 square feet of industrial space at the edge of Manhattan, Kansas, on a road that still carries the company's name. The ceiling is 18 feet high. The column spacing is 35 feet. The loading docks face the Kansas flatland, open to a sky that has no memory of what happened inside. The air smells of nothing in particular now. Warehouse tenants store what warehouses store. The precision cutting machines are gone. The 5 tissue presses are scrap metal somewhere. The women who ran them have moved on to other work, or to retirement, or to the particular stillness that follows the end of labor, that gave your days a shape and your hands a purpose. At the University of Rhode Island in the Carruthers Library in Kingston, the Commercial Pattern Archive holds more than 60,000 physical sewing patterns dating to 1847. The world's largest collection, assembled from the lifelong personal collection of a woman named Betty Williams and expanded by Professor Joy Spanabel Emery, who spent her career documenting an industry that most historians overlooked and who died in 2018. The patterns are stored in acid-free folders in a climate-controlled room. The tissue is fragile. The printing is still legible after 100 years. In Baltimore, the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture occupies 82,000 square feet on the Inner Harbor, a Smithsonian affiliate, the largest African American museum on the East Coast. It was seeded by $5 million from the foundation that bears the name of the man who turned a $1 million investment in a Kansas pattern company into a career that reshaped what was considered possible in American finance. In Neenah, Wisconsin, the last tissue pattern presses in the United States still run. 78 people produce McCall's, Simplicity, Butterick, and Vogue patterns for a customer base that is small, passionate, and unlikely to grow in the way it once did. The sewing community that remains knows what it's preserving. They share patterns online, alter them, teach their children to sew. They understand, in the specific way that practitioners understand, that a skill transmitted hand to hand across generations is a different thing from a skill recovered from a YouTube tutorial, and that both are better than the skill being lost entirely. James McCall's mother burned to death when he was a boy in Scotland. He crossed an ocean, learned a trade, married a woman who would run his company after he died, and built from a rented room on Union Square with a drafting chart and a tailor's eye, an enterprise that put a pattern on the kitchen table of 52 million American homes. His name is still on the envelope. The tissue is still thin enough to see your hand through, and the instructions still assume, as they always have, that the woman holding the scissors knows what she's doing or is ready to learn. What isn't there anymore is the work, not the printing, not the cutting, not the folding, not the 1,000 workers across 3 shifts, not the 30,000 pattern counters, not the billion-dollar habit that once made home sewing as ordinary as home cooking. What remains is the pattern itself, a set of lines on tissue paper, still precise, still useful, still carrying the quiet promise that began with an orphan tailor in Scotland, that you can make something beautiful with your own hands if someone shows you where to cut.